back Chris Lipp, the author and instructor of the Startup Pitch. For those of you who have taken the course, this is the final week, so you're putting the whole thing together, the last 5 weeks of putting your pitch together, and Chris will be able to answer any of your questions you have about the 4-point formulas or the influence, the elements of influence, that sort of thing. So please feel free to ask your questions. I'm going to kick it off, of course, to begin with. Chris, you highlight, of course, the 4-point formula as the way to organize a pitch. Do pitches work really when they're not in the exact order that you say?
Great question. Well, one of the problems a lot of pitches face is they don't have any formula, right? So they end up starting with their solution because entrepreneurs want to talk about the product first, but we know that a pitch is not about your product. A pitch is about presenting the value of your product. As a result, the 4-point formula is built on that. So we start with the problem and move into the solution. Now we know that 90% of pitches that win funding start with a problem, so the 4-point formula is based on a lot of data of what has actually worked. However, I've seen pitches that also do problem, solution, and then they do business market. And for anyone who's read my book, you'll see very clearly there are 4 points to the 4-point formula, but you can de-emphasize 1 or 2 just so that you have a pitch that flows to your strengths. And these are some of the benefits I outline in my book, and we also see in the course.
Okay, you're starting with the problem. How deep do you end up going into describing that problem?
Investors hear a lot of problems, and one of the things, if we look at what Bill Reichert says from Garage Technology Ventures, he'll say that he doesn't like entrepreneurs starting with the problem because a lot of times entrepreneurs are very comfortable talking about the problem, so they talk forever about it, and that just is the interest of the investor.
Yeah.
Right? What we want to do is we want to be able to talk about the problem but move quickly into our solution. So for those who aren't familiar, what I introduce is a 30-90 rule, which again, based on the data of successful pitches, if your problem is very simple and straightforward, you should be able to present it in 30 seconds. And I have a very specific outline both in the course and my book on how to do that persuasively. If you have a very difficult problem or a very complex problem, you could spend up to 90 seconds, let's say at a 10-minute pitch, going into those details of the problem. But within 90 seconds, you really do, particularly if you follow my formula, you really are able to capture everything you need to say about it and move then into your product.
If the investors are trying to kind of rush you through the problem, though, they're like, okay, we know about that. We want to move through. Is there another way to sort of bring, you haven't finished talking about your problem yet. Is there another way to bring it back to the forefront?
It's very rare that if you do the problem well, an investor will interrupt you. They tend to interrupt you if you're spending too long on it. And being too long is it happens quite frequently. If an investor interrupts you and you want to move on, but you want to relate back to the problem, that's very simple. So for example, when you're listing off the benefits of your solution, you can always contrast those to the pains of the problem. So with our new app, for example, we tell you when you can water your plants anytime so your garden's always green, rather than being like your neighbor's garden, which is always brown. Very simple contrast, assuming your neighbor doesn't have the app, and again, the pain to the benefit.
That's what you're talking about when you talk about concrete pains. Do you have any other examples of what concrete pains, kinds of examples that you can introduce?
Absolutely. The problem is not enough per se to demonstrate a need for your solution. You want to be able to explain the results of the problem. What do people with that problem suffer from? What happens to them as a result of having this issue? Those are the pains. So, for example, you may have a computer system that is slow, okay? And the result of that is you work less efficiently, your employees work less efficiently, you have to stay later. These are the pains that you suffer by having a slow system. When you put in more pains into your problem, then you make it more influential, and investors are more likely to see your solution than easing those pains as a more valuable solution.
Okay. I notice we do have some viewers, so please, give us your questions on anything you want to know about the Startup Pitch. This is your last opportunity to talk to Chris Lipp, the instructor and author of Startup Pitch. Chris, when you're describing your market, the temptation is to just make this huge market that looks like your product is going to make billions within the first couple of years.
Right.
What are the dangers there?
If you make a very large market, you would think that an investor is like, wow, that's great. We only need to capture a small percent of this. When in fact, the truth is that the risk of, let's say you're an investor and you're going to invest in another startup. You want to earn money, but you also want to ensure that you have low risk, right? So if you want to minimize the risk, the higher risk for you as an investor is not them earning a lot of money. The higher risk for you is them earning any money, right? Once you get into a market, it's easier to expand, but getting into the market's the hard part. So the goal is to start in a very targeted market, a very specific niche or segment. If you can capture that, then you can expand your market. So thus, it's better to present your target market as this niche or this segment because it communicates to the investor that A, you understand your market, so you're likely to get it, and B, you have a realistic approach, a realistic goal that you can achieve.
And that kind of goes into my next question, was just how detailed should you be in trying to describe, target customers in a pitch?
Let's say that you want to use the 4-point formula. Well, you know that you need to tailor it in order to be effective, right? And I outline tailoring in my book. It's outlined in the course. And if you're going to tailor and you're going to emphasize the market as one of the main points, again, when the 4-point formula, you really only want to emphasize 2 or 3 points and glide over the other remaining points very quickly. So let's say that market is one of your key points, right? So then you're going to look at the target, you're going to look at a customer, and you want to be able to get into the detail, literally where you can tell a day in the life of story, the way that Steve Blank emphasizes in his book, right? What is a day in the life of this customer that you're going after? How old are they? What do they look like? What do they do? What is their daily routine? When you know that level of detail, and you don't have to share it all within the pitch, but when you know it, you know what are the important aspects of that lifestyle that allow you to interact with them and thus win their business.
Great. Okay, well, we have a question from one of the students, Shane Ballman. So I've heard some say that a pitch should be 10 slides. Then others say the number of slides isn't so important. Just keep it under 7 minutes. Is there a magic number for both, or should that be more of a gut reaction for your pitch content?
I'm thinking of exactly the page number you could refer to if you had my book. But there's the 10-20-30 rule, which is probably this idea, 10 slides, 20 minutes, 30-point font. This is Guy Kawasaki's rule. Okay, right, it's understandable, but what I like, my favorite quote actually comes from Robert Scoble, a famous blogger that I'm sure everybody knows, and he says, when he was asked, what is the best slide deck, he responded, having none. So in other words, you don't want to have a slide deck per se. You're there to convince the investor that they're going to invest in you, right? People always talk about investing in the team. So your slides support you. How many slides then do you need? You need exactly the number of slides that you need to support your main points. 10 is a good number because it kind of rounds nicely. It prevents you from getting too many. But those pitches that win funding, they have had 6, they could have 8, they could have 3. Pitches have had one funding with 0 that I know of. So again, I would say 10 is the upper limit. In terms of the length of the pitch, we got to remember that a pitch is a conversation more than it is going to be a presentation. So there's no finite rule. I think if you can make your pitch, I'll give you just some actual data. Reid Hoffman said that you should be able to get to the main points of your pitch and provide a value statement within the first few minutes. So a 7-minute pitch is a great, let's say, length for you to have pre-practiced, or maybe even up to 10 minutes of what you want to say. But let's say that you're going to have a 30-minute time with investors. A lot of that's going to be interacting Q&A. So you want to prepare for Q&A as well. That's important.
And do you think people depend too much trying to do data in their pitches rather than just using maybe powerful images? I mean, if you had to choose between the two.
Well, there's research here at Stanford that shows that people remember data 5% of the time and stories 63% of the time.
Well,
When I talked to an investor not a few months ago, he said, the company that I invest in is the company that's still running through my mind when I'm laying down to sleep that evening. So we want to recognize that in order to be successful, we need to have an emotional impact. We need to tell stories. The data is important because the data helps prove to our investors that what we're talking about is real and that it's grounded in something tangible, but it's not going to win them. We need the story combined with the data to win them.
what if you can't really accurately identify your market? Do you leave it out? Do you focus on other things in that 4-point formula? What do you do?
You could do that. There are a lot of teams who are seeking angel funding, and they don't necessarily have a strong market or business model. However, they do recognize a strong problem. So if you really don't understand your market or necessarily how to capture that market, which is business, you would want to really ensure you understand the problem. Because startups are more than a solution without a problem. It's a very rare chance that an investor will put their money into.
And when you talk about milestones, what if you really you don't really have any yet? You're all banking on the future kind of thing. How much do you do that? Do you try to stay away from it because you don't really have anything credible to present in terms of the milestones you've achieved?
Well, let's look at what milestones are. So milestones have two parts: what you've achieved and what you're going to achieve. What you've achieved, and pretty much anybody who wins funding has walked in doing something. Usually they've bootstrapped themselves, they've done tests. Let's say that you don't have a product yet. Hopefully you've done some sort of research or some sort of testing to prove the viability of your product or the viability of the market or to demonstrate that this problem is actually tangible. All of that are things you can add into your milestones that you've accomplished. So all startups that are going to get funding do have milestones. If you don't have milestones, you're not ready for funding yet. If you're looking forward and you're looking what you're going to accomplish in the future, those are important to show that you have a path to growth. So you're not walking into a room with an investor saying, hey, give us money and we'll figure out what to do. In fact, Paul Graham, he says that the most attractive thing, one of the most attractive things in an entrepreneur is when they come in with the character kind of that, hey, we're going to succeed whether or not you give us money. He says that's more likely than we're going to invest in them. So if you have milestones, you're kind of, in some sense, implicitly saying, yeah, we have this plan forward and we're going to walk this path regardless if you give us money. However, your money will help us get there quicker.
Obviously, credibility is crucial in a pitch because investors are investing, and if they have to find you credible before they'll give you any money. What are really the best ways to establish your credibility? I mean, can you also just do that in terms of the way you deliver, the way you present, in addition to the data you're presenting?
Well, what is credibility? I think this is a very important question you bring up. If somebody off the street were to walk in and give you an idea, say, hey, this is a great stock to invest in, the likelihood is you're not going to invest in it. Now, let's say that Bill Gates walks in off the street and says, hey, I really need to invest in this stock. It's going to grow. You're probably more likely to take his advice seriously, right, and to listen to his reasoning. So credibility is about establishing why people should listen to you. There are a couple of ways to establish credibility. One way is simply to state your background, if your background experience relates to what you're doing. For example, you have 20 years in circuit design and you're designing a new device. Great, that's very clear, right? A team kind of slide thing that you would put. If you speak eloquently, fluently, that shows a lot of credibility because it's creating an emotional impression that this guy's a leader. You can also borrow the credibility of other experts by quoting people who believe in you. And this is what we see, for example, let's say you have a little bit of an investor who's going to invest in you. Well, the likelihood is more people invest in you. That's actually social proof, but it could be used as credibility saying, hey, this investor believes in us and he's saying this, so you should think this too. Ultimately, to respond, credibility is an important part, and the way to establish credibility is to demonstrate through your words why you're the right person to understand this problem, create the right solution, or tackle the market.
How can you present, when you're presenting data, you know, that you have some that you think is crucial to your presentation, you know, how do you not make people's eyes roll back in their head? I mean, how do you make it real, the data?
How do you make the real data real?
Yeah.
A couple of ways. If you, and I'm hesitant to say this after listening to what Robert Scoble says about slides, but if you put your data in a slide, we know from research that data becomes over 50%, I believe, more persuasive than if you were just to say it in Word, right? So you might have a clear data on your slide, like one pie chart or a trend line or something, or a bar chart. It's very easy to screw up data slides, and so I write a whole chapter on doing slides just because slides can actually damage your presentation more than they help it. But if you do a really clean data slide, it's going to work wonders for you. That will impact how the message lands on your audience. So, for example, if you want to say, hey, you know, there are X number of people suffering from this problem, and you make it visual, that will hit the audience. The size of that number will hit them greater when you make it visual. The other way to emphasize data is to combine it with a story. So you might, one example, you might have starving children in a third world country that you have a new solution to cure their hunger. So you'll give a story about one person you met named Joe, and how you were able to help Joe, and he had a starving family, and you gave him food, and then he lived where he would have otherwise died. And then after you tell the story, it's very powerful, connects, and you can say there are 1 million other children just like Joe. And we want your money to help support them and save their lives. So what you do is you use the data to emphasize the impact of the story, to blow up the story into a bigger picture, not just numbers per se.
Right, not just presenting the data, but making it something that emphasizes something else in your pitch.
Yeah, the data makes it real, the stories make it meaningful. So if you can make the meaning real, make the stories real with data, then you've got some serious power.
Okay, we've got another question from Darla Brown this time, which was one of the questions I was going to ask. How should a deck be different when it's posted online? Well, actually, mine's a little different than this, but if it's posted online like an angel list versus being presented in person, more text, longer?
All of the above. Think about the difference in what we're accomplishing here. When we're in a pitch room and we're having a conversation with an investor, we're going through our slides, those slides are backing us up, but we're the powerhouse in that room. We're the most persuasive element as the presenter. So we relegate the slides to supporting us. When you put a slides online, there is no you to be able to present them. So suddenly the slides become the only medium of communication. That's when you want to start adding more text, adding more details. Still want maybe clear images, but something that somebody will read as opposed to just glance at.
Okay. We have another one from Shane Ballman. Is it dangerous to float milestones with hard dates for a pre-seed? If someone says, quote, with this investment I can have a marketable product in 12 months, does that statement unnecessarily lock you into that position?
Unnecessarily lock you. Think about it from the investor's perspective as opposed to your perspective as the entrepreneur, right? The risk for you, it sounds to me, is that you're worried you may not be able to deliver, or that there's some risk to you, that you want a little more maybe space in case whatever happens, right? Now, from an investor's perspective, it's probably the opposite. They're thinking, we want to make sure this guy delivers something by some date. We want some sort of milestone that show this person's on the track. So it can help to have milestones. More specific, I'm trying to think of other ways though that you could think about this. Not all pitches that win funding have specific milestones, particularly at the seed stage. So is it necessary? No, because last month, there were a couple of startups that I worked with that won funding, and they did not have explicit milestones. They had visions, generally, of where they're going. So I think at an early stage, the evidence shows that was fine.
Okay. Actually, I want to go back to the question I was going to ask about the online, doing a pitch online. What if you get in a situation where you do it in a like a conference call hangout situation where they can see you and you can present some kind of deck? You don't necessarily want more text then, do you?
Absolutely not. I coached something like 15 entrepreneurs from India at the beginning of May, and so they presented in video, and I got to look at their slides. When those slides were busy and there was a lot of text, it was the same effect as if it was live. I just totally tuned them out to read the text, or I just saw this really busy slide pop up on my screen. It was so ugly and distracting that I ignored it, right? So this is the risk, whether it's in person or through the web, of having a busy slide. Either the investor is going to listen to you and ignore the slide, or they're going to read the slide and ignore you. In either case, you lose.
What do you do if investors ask you about your exit strategy? You know, how prepared should you be for that? Should you bring it up before they ask?
Don't bring up exit strategy. And if an investor asks about exit strategy, here's the problem. They're probably looking for a quick turnaround of a company. They're not really involved in what you're doing. They're just totally about the money. That's not an investor that you want. That's not an investor. So let's say that they do. If they do ask you about exit strategy, you have to answer that question, right? You could, and so one of the optimal answers, and I can't remember the famous investor who said it right now, but he said, just tell the investor that, you know, we're going to develop this product and watch how the market moves, and based on the market, we're going to make a choice that, you know, we're going to respond to the market as appropriate, or what seems best for the company at the time. In other words, you're deferring the question to the future. Exit strategy is not a topic that is an important topic in a good pitch.
Okay. You know, obviously doing a pitch at a tech conference or something in front of an audience is very different than doing in front of a panel, and very different than what you would do in person when you actually know you've gotten a meeting with the investors. What are the differences really between the two in the way you present, other than the obvious part of just, you know, one's narration? Maybe they ask some questions at the end, the panel does, but what are the biggest differences, do you think, about the way you would present those pitches?
What are the biggest differences between presenting to a panel and one-on-one?
Pardon me? Yeah, and doing it one-on-one.
I mean, the biggest difference is the obvious, that it's a conversation as opposed to a presentation. So if you're presenting on stage, you're just going to have a long flow, a 7-minute flow. If you're presenting in person, you could, in your second or third sentence, be interrupted by a question. So I pitched a long time ago to Y Combinator, and we had a pitch ready. It was a beautiful pitch, and after our first sentence, we got interrupted by the investor. Within the first couple sentences, we got interrupted, and then we got interrupted again with another question and a question and a question. And I think part of the reason the investor was doing this was because they wanted to derail us, and which makes us more vulnerable rather than kind of showing a face that we wanted to present. That's the difference between a conversation and a presentation, is that it's very possible that you may not be able to present the way you think you're going to present. I have a colleague who got into Y Combinator, and the way he did it was, he said he and his team they practiced Q&A for 3 full days before they moved into their meeting. So just Q&A. They already had their presentation done, practiced, and prepared, and then they put all this extra several hours, right, tens of hours into that. That's the importance of Q&A. That's the difference between a live presentation to a panel versus in person.
Yeah, that's goes along with news interviews when people are being interviewed about controversial things. They need to have their team ask them every question in the world. So it's being, again, you talk about practice, practicing your pitch, practice, practice, practice. But practicing those unseen, unforeseen questions can really be invaluable, right?
Absolutely.
And talk about creating dialogue. What if the investors don't seem that engaged and they're not, you think you're going to get all these great questions and you're ready to answer these questions and they just don't seem to be engaging? How do you get them to engage?
There are several strategies to get an investor to engage. I'm thinking of how detailed you want to get. There's a lot of suave ways to do it. There are some explicit ways to do it, some softer ways to do it. Perhaps the easiest way is move into a story, right? Get away from the data, get away from the explanation, get out of their heads, because that's obviously, it's like, think of a classroom, right? When the teacher's up there and this is how you do it and this is physics. I remember I had to take physics when I was getting my engineering degree at UC Berkeley, and I had this one professor who was so boring. Every time he'd talk, he'd like chalk on the board and explain these equations for how a balloon rises in the sky or how, whatever the case. It was totally boring, and to the point that I remember one time, probably everybody has an experience where you're sleeping and then you fall in the middle of class off your desk where you're resting your head. But anyway, enough about me. So if you tell a story, and when the professors, I'm sure you remember in college, told stories about fun times they had or kind of vulnerable times or painful times, that's when you capture their attention. So for example, in a pitch, Kindar, I visited, this was back at even 2012, Founder Showcase event. Kindar tied for first place at this event, and they opened with a story. It was the most beautiful story I'd ever seen about her and her mother's struggles with the problem they were facing. And I write about this all in my book, but when everybody was pretty much wrapped into it, and when it ended, there was huge applause. There was people like sighing audibly that like it had captured them that well. Remember the power of stories. They had data, of course they had data, but it didn't revolve around the data. It revolved around the power of what they were presenting.
Great. We have a question. Since the pitch is really just there to secure a next meeting, is it better to have a high-level overview for a pitch number 1 and then a second longer presentation for meeting number 2?
First date is a prequel to getting married. Does that mean you should take this first date as sort of like high-level, generic? No, of course not, right? You really do need to put in details. You do need to get down into it because a lot of judgments are being made right up front, just as in any first date. What you do want to give them to walk away with is not only how valuable your product is, but also a very clean explanation so they can take it back and discuss it internally whether this is something they want to promote.
Okay, final question here. What happens if you're getting peppered with really pretty hostile questions? Obviously, the investors are not just not engaged; they're just not buying what you're selling, and they're just constantly peppering you with questions. What is the best? What's your best strategy there?
So, as you may know in relationships, love and hate are opposite sides of the same coin. Right? So the more they hate you, probably the more they loved you. Anybody who's gone through a breakup knows how much somebody... Anyway, so many years ago I went through a job interview just on the same theme. And one guy walked in, all the interviews had been good, and this one guy walked in, big up VP, and just started to grill the hell out of me. And he was harsh. He was yelling at me these questions and things, really, really not testing me, but being vehemently negative. And I was able to answer his questions. I remember there was one point where he asked me this question. I had to stop. I thought about it, and I gave him an answer, and it just made him completely stop. And his whole face changed. He smiled. He brightened up, and after that, we bonded. So by being able to field his negative questions, in a way that didn't cause more conflict. That's the big thing. It actually brought us closer together and won him over because he was so involved now with me. The worst thing you can do as an entrepreneur if somebody's giving you hard questions is to be defensive and try to explain yourself like, hey, why'd you do this? And you're like, well, we did this because we thought it would be better. No, right? The minute you get offensive like that and conflictual, you've lost. But let's say they're offensive, and then you say, well, I hear what you're saying. This could be a real issue. That's why we did X, Y, and Z, and we believe that this is going to reduce that risk, right? So you really accept them. Then you're going to be on the same team. That's the goal. If you can achieve same team, regardless of how hostile they are at the beginning, you're going to succeed.
Well, great, Chris. Thank you so much for joining us and for joining us for all the Hangouts and for the class and the folks who joined us. The assignments you can fill in your assignments for the next couple of weeks, even after the next week's deadline, because we realize people are really busy, and we definitely want you to complete them because we think they're important to learning how to do a good pitch. So, Chris, once again, thank you so much. Anything you want to say to folks for the final Hangout here?
Yes. There's been a lot of success I've had working with startups, and I'll tell you what the real magic is. A pitch is not about presenting your product. Pitch is about presenting the value of your product. Whether it's a first meeting or a fifth meeting, if in your pitch you're able to create enough value around your product to explain why this is good for people and for the market, for making money, then if you create enough value, investors will trade their cash, their value, for the value you've created in your pitch. That's the key. That one lesson there will make you rise above countless other pitches.
Great, Chris, thank you. And for those of you who didn't buy the book, he really does go into some great examples in detail. And the Startup Pitch is available on Amazon. So be sure to get it if you did not. Once again, Chris Lipp, thank you so much for joining us and for the class.
Thank you, Rusty. Always a pleasure.